Good evening, everyone. I'm again Professor Barlo Demirgadician with the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State, and you're joining us this evening for one of our presentations in the spring 2022 lecture series of the Armenian Studies program. So I'd really like to welcome all of you here. And typically at the beginning of each presentation, before I introduce our guest, I'd like to share the screen with you to tell you a little bit about some of our upcoming events, because the month of March and even early April will be quite busy for us. So let me share the screen with you. And we're going to go back over to actually our upcoming events in the months of February and March. Next week, which is actually March, on Friday, March the 4th, the Fresno State Armenian Studies program and the Philip Lawrence Keyboard Concert Series are sponsoring a newly formed group called the Komitas Trio. And these are three Armenians from Los Angeles who are going to be joining together to give a concert. This is going to be in person. Michael Kirkorian on piano on the left, Arusak Baltayan playing violin in the center, and Gadik Terzian on the cello. You do need tickets for that. If you're interested, contact us, or you can go again to our website or to Facebook. Also on Tuesday, March the 8th, we are going to be holding a presentation by Dr. Suren Manukyan called New Trends in Genocide Studies. Last semester, Dr. Manukyan was the Kazan visiting professor at Fresno State, but he was teaching all of his courses online. This lecture will be our first lecture in person in almost 2 years since the pandemic began. If you're interested, you'll come out to that. We'll also be recording it for our YouTube channel. Then on Sunday, March the 20th, the Armenian Studies program is holding its 34th annual banquet, and this celebrates the 45th anniversary of our program. We typically like to recognize our seniors who are graduating with an Armenian Studies minor, and we also recognize our Armenian Studies scholarship recipients. It's a special occasion for us. Then on Saturday, April the 2nd, the Armenian Studies program and the Fresno State Department of Music present two artists, Boris Alaferdian, who is the principal clarinet with the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, along with his wife, Aline Alaferdian, who will be accompanying him on piano. This is a special concert with the Fresno State Department of Music. It will be held on Saturday, April the 2nd at 6 p.m. Again, tickets are required. The information will be out soon about how to obtain tickets. A little bit about this evening's lecture. As I mentioned to you before, I put into the link the book, which is seen on the bottom right, Captive Knights from the Bosporus to Gallipoli with Zabel Yessayan. And the presentation tonight will be called Reading History, Remaking Memory with Zabel Yessayan on Translating an Armenian Author's Turkish Women. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Nanor Kebranian. She is a researcher, writer, and translator working at the intersection of history, law, and literature. She received her doctorate from Oxford University with fellowships from the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation and Oxford's Clarendon Fund. And she's held research positions at Columbia University, Queen Mary University of London, and Nanyang Technological University. The book Captive Knights is her second collaborative project with translator G.M. Goshkarian, following the publication of the book Remnants, authored by Hagop Oshagan, and which was published by the Gomidas Institute in 2013. So tonight, Dr. Kebranian is going to be speaking about Zabel Yessayan, one of the preeminent writers of the early 20th century, late 19th century and early 20th century. And she'll be focusing on three of the translated stories which are found in the collection that I've been mentioning to you. And she'll talk about the impact of Yessayan's work in literature. So it's a pleasure to introduce today Dr. Nanor Kebranian as our guest speaker. Dr. Kebranian.
Thank you so much, Barlo. It's great to see also all the musical events happening there. I wish I could join you. I assume you can hear me fine? Yes?
Yes.
Right. Hi, everybody. It's evening where you are, but it's morning here in Singapore. So welcome to the 21st century. I guess I'm speaking to you from the future. And as Barlo said, I'll be speaking about the book Captive Knights today, since that's what has brought us together. And I want to give you some background on actually how it came to be. Often in Armenian culture, we tend to suddenly be gifted with these projects, but we don't really know the background, and the background itself can be sort of interesting to get an idea of. First of all, it's kind of an unusual translation project in that it's actually thematically organized. So generally, Armenian translations or translations from Armenian tend to be done or have been done somewhat haphazardly. That's changing a bit. So it makes sense that they tend to present classics of Armenian literature, or they tend to be grouped into anthologies by genre, so poetry or theater, or they tend to be a collection of selected works by a single author, sort of representative works of a single author. Or alternatively, you might get excerpts from key texts as part of literary histories. So I'm thinking, for example, of the Heritage of Armenian Literature, which is a very valuable volume to introduce people to the entire history of Armenian literature, where you get sort of excerpts of certain representative texts by author or movement. But it's rare to find Armenian literature organized by theme or specific kinds of social or cultural experiences. And so this volume might actually be the first of its kind in that respect. I don't want to sound immodest, but it's certainly sort of an experimental move toward that style of editorial work. I'm not in the least sort of ignoring the fact that the Armenian International Women's Association, for example, has been already on that track. So for some time now, they've been translating Armenian women's writing into English, especially those commenting on Armenian women's issues. And I imagine that those of you who've joined tonight who are interested in Zabel Yessayan's work also know some of her work through their Zabel Yessayan translation project, which has made several of her sort of best works available, as well as some of her lesser known social commentaries, especially on Armenian women's issues, to an English readership. And then Barlo and I were just talking about Araz Yayancılık in Istanbul, that's sort of implicitly been doing a similar thing. So this is an Armenian and Turkish language press in Istanbul. For those of you who don't know, that's been extremely active in the last couple of decades in translating Armenian literature and history, etc., into Turkish, as well as literary criticism. So it's played an incredible role in revising and even rewriting narratives about the history and the presence of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire in Turkey just by translating Armenian literary works into Turkish. So it's now become very difficult in Turkey to just ignore or sideline, and I mean that sort of in legitimate scholarship and discourses, the role and significance of Armenians in Ottoman and Turkish literary culture. So for Araz, the specific Turkish context itself in that sense provides a kind of organizing or thematic principle without necessarily setting out on sort of an explicitly stated social or cultural agenda or project. And Captive Nights, my objective wasn't then just simply to provide more translations of an Armenian writer's work. I had two aims in mind. One was to try to reorient Armenian cultural and social consciousness, especially regarding Armeno-Turkish history. And the other was to sort of introduce a new and kind of a more coherent way of producing translations from Armenian literature. There's a very copious body of modern Armenian literature that really can and should be translated, but is sort of appearing very haphazardly. And I thought I'd kind of hopefully initiate a way of conducting those translations that speak to the cultural and social moment. So I hope the book serves that end as a kind of editorial model. But I think apart from the cultural and aesthetic values of translating, which is itself an art really, translations also have a social and political role to play. And I was very cognizant of that when I embarked on this project. Especially as the number of Armenian readers kind of continues to dwindle, and I mean Armenian language readers. Western Armenian is still considered an endangered language by UNESCO, and Armenian culture in the diaspora in Armenia is still really grappling with the legacies of historical violence. So theoretically, and thematically informed or framed translations can be a really great avenue, kind of a social and cultural compass, if you like, especially in the context of Armeno-Turkish interactions. And again, that's the spirit with which I approached this work. Now, the thematic frames for Captive Nights to me became apparent almost 20 years ago, and that's sort of hard to believe that it's taken this long for it to kind of materialize. But those ideas really, those themes really started to kind of coalesce and take shape for me during my doctoral research, as I was starting to unearth material that, as far as I could see, had been basically entirely overlooked or maybe even ignored, deliberately ignored in Armenian literary scholarship and cultural discourse. So at the time, what I was really interested in, what got me into the research was the question of representations of Turks and Armeno-Turkish relations in Ottoman Armenian literature. It was evident from the little commentary that existed on that topic, and I mean little, I mean that's less than a handful, right? That I'd have to start with Hago Poshagan. So the commentary itself sort of oriented me towards the works of Hago Poshagan, who is basically a contemporary of Zabel Yessayan. Now, I've written about and spoken about Oshagan quite a bit, so I don't want to spend too much time on him here, but he is exceptional in many ways, but especially in his thematic approach, and especially in his post-genocide works and his novels. So his project, one of his explicitly stated projects after the First World War, after the genocide, was to reproduce and represent the Ottoman Armenian social and cultural life in the Ottoman Empire's final decades. And he really was particularly committed to conducting that work with reference to the rural provincial Armenian experience. And that made sense, right? Because the vast majority of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire lived in the provinces, not in Istanbul and Izmir, or even in Bursa. So no other Armenian had even contemplated doing that, let alone attempted it, except recently Garen Jallatyan, another literary scholar, apparently unearthed an unpublished manuscript, an unfinished manuscript by Vahe Oshagan, in which he kind of tries to follow in his father's footsteps. And you can maybe ask him about that if you ever encounter him somewhere. But almost all of Hago Oshagan's post-war novels were an attempt to recreate the Ottoman Armenian past. And as a very crucial component of that experience, Oshagan also very explicitly, very deliberately set out to present Armeno-Turkish relations. And he was especially interested in imperial dynamics as well as interpersonal dynamics, but the sort of the intersection of those two, how the imperial system affected those interpersonal dynamics. Oddly though, despite being quite a prominent author, extremely influential, also a teacher, that aspect of his work really had gone unnoticed, and several scholars have engaged, have engaged with those Turkish contexts and figures, but the sort of the interpersonal imperial intersection has gone unnoticed, even if their observation of Oshagan's Turkish context and figures have not. So every one of these studies, when they do comment on the Turkish context in Oshagan's work, tends to unproblematically frame his figures within the framework of Armeno-Turkish enmity. So they sort of come to the texts with that preparation, and the text then becomes an affirmation or confirmation of those pre-existing post-genocidal frames. And it's really only Hago Poshagan's son, Vahe Oshagan, and he himself was a highly innovative writer, critic, and an influential scholar who took a different view. And he pointed out that, and I'm going to quote from him now, that for the first time in Armenian letters, that is in Oshagan's works, a Turk is shown to be a normal human being capable of holding rational discourse. And so Vahe Oshagan commented that his father's novels didn't just humanize, but that they even, quote, transformed totally the stereotyped image of a cold-blooded beast that had persisted in Armenian literature for 60 years. So that's Vahe Oshagan's statement about his father's innovations. Now, when I read these lines, I took them as an invitation to get Oshagan translated and published straight away. And this was around 2009, so the time was ripe. Momentum had really built up in scholarship and cultural and public discourse about Armeno-Turkish dialogue, collaboration, reconciliation, all sorts of things. And it seemed like the exact right time to present Oshagan's work to the world. I knew that part of Oshagan's novel Remnants had already been partially translated, so I commissioned the rest of the translation from publication funds available to me. And then I sort of midwifed, if you want to put it that way, a prestigious Penheim translation grant for the translator, G.M. Goshgarian. And we were able to bring the first book of Remnants to light in 2013 via the Gomidas Institute. I mentioned Remnants because it's, and its translation, because it's kind of a conceptual and practical antecedent to Captive Nights. It was around the same time, while I was doing my doctoral research, that I started realizing that maybe Oshagan wasn't as exceptional as he'd been made out to be with respect to his Turkish context and characters. And I was specifically exploring his representation of Turkish women when I turned up Yessayan's novella Melihal Nurihanu. And that's that's the first story, in fact, of the three in the book Captive Nights. And I realized there may be more to this theme of Turkish women in Armenian letters, going perhaps well beyond Oshagan and even anticipating Oshagan. So my most recent research findings for my monograph have kind of vindicated that suspicion. And so I had Meliha Nurihanu translated, that was back in 2011, in the hopes that it would end up becoming maybe part of an anthology or a collection like this one, Captive Nights. So as I said, that was in 2011. And of course, in research, one thing leads to another. So the discovery of Meliha Nurihanu then led to further research, which then for me turned up The Veil, Kore, and Enough, Pavagane. And those are the other two stories that are in this collection. So I had enough then to do what I had hoped, which was to present for the very first time a major Ottoman Armenian author's engagements with Armeno-Turkish sympathy, compassion, and solidarity. And I found myself telling Vahe Oshagan posthumously that he actually stands corrected, that his father was not indeed the first Western Armenian author, or prominent one anyway, to humanize Turkish characters in his work. It was actually Zabel Yessayan who first achieved that task. And the three stories in Captive Nights, in that respect, are truly groundbreaking, yeah? Especially The Veil, which was written in 1914, so just before the genocide. Now, it's important to note that Yessayan's writings on Turkish or Muslim women are actually not limited to just these works. Her Turkish or Muslim women protagonists actually go back to before the turn of the 20th century and continue after the First World War. But it's really between 1908 and 1914 that something happens, and that Muslim Turkish women become a real focal point for her. I've actually uncovered several previously entirely unknown stories and commentaries by Yessayan written during this time period that comment directly on Turkish women's issues and rights. These are stories and commentaries that don't exist in any bibliographies and haven't been noted by any sort of scholars of women's literature or women's history. I mean, Armenian women's literature and history. So she was writing against the practice of veiling. She was writing against the discriminatory system of the harem, unfair divorce practices, and the sort of terrible custom of releasing women. This was a custom where Muslim husbands could basically get rid of their wives just by uttering 3 times that they're divorcing them. And this would leave the woman often homeless with nowhere to go, a very cruel practice of abandonment, and it would be catastrophic for these women. It's a custom that Hago Poshagan also revisits in a couple of his novels, but especially in his work Haji Abdullah from 1934. So Yessayan, like Oshagan after her, it was clear, showed a sustained engagement with the plight of Turkish and more generally Muslim women that until now was virtually unknown, despite the prominence of these two authors. And that's unfortunately part of a broader oversight, or indeed one can say a process of deliberate concealment on the part of the post-genocide Armenian nationalist leadership. So the aim of that leadership after the genocide was to sever all Armenian ties with the Ottoman past, even if that meant imposing various forms of cultural amnesia. This also meant, unfortunately, erasing the traces of any semblance of Armeno-Turkish Christian-Muslim social or cultural correspondences, and let alone appropriations, amalgamations, and certainly least of all, amity. We have historian Vahe Tashcan to thank for bringing that process to light as one of the most important but unrecognized socio-cultural consequences of the genocide. I won't summarize too much, but suffice it to say that Tashcan's work has really demonstrated how post-genocide Armenian national leaders imposed a program of national purification among surviving Ottoman Armenians. This meant that they stigmatized the practice of customs associated with the Ottoman Turkish past. These included conversational Turkish songs and music, Ottoman-style clothing. And so Vahe Tashcan says that for the Armenians who had gone through this fearful experience of genocide, matters were simple. The break with the Ottoman world was to be absolute. Armenian leaders worked to eradicate all everyday phenomena that continued to link the Armenians to the Turks and the Turkish-Ottoman environment. And so whatever links remained then or were fostered were those of hostility and enmity. So as Tashcan's comments indicate, Ottoman Armenian history consisted of multi-ethnic coexistence and inevitably cultural cross-pollination, like shared customs, songs, and languages. But post-genocide Armenian nationalist purification was so successful that until the 2000s, that's over 80 years after the genocide, it was still unthinkable to suggest that such amalgamations existed, and let alone to investigate them. Armenian literary scholarship also contributed to these processes of forgetting. The Ottoman world rarely appears in such histories or studies, except for passing mentions of censorship or destructive political events. Now, ironically, it was the work of progressive Turkish literary scholars or European scholars of Ottoman and Turkish literature in the early mid-2000s that began to write about Armenian literature as part of the Ottoman framework. And it's thanks to that work that we've learned a lot about where Ottoman Armenian writers belonged in this world, that they composed works in Turkish, that they engaged in literary and theatrical collaborations, that they provided cross-communal translations, and that they practiced reading across languages and communities as well. So these findings have been incredibly important milestones in revising Armenian nationalist relatives that have really pushed the Ottoman context out of the Armenian cultural picture. And that's really how or why I ended up pursuing this line of work 20 years ago. I was a young scholar in the making. I had a keen interest in philosophy and literature, especially in questions of memory and identity. And as I began to explore these topics independently and in relation to modern Armenian literature, it was quickly evident that there was a significant piece missing from the Armenian literary puzzle. And that piece was the Ottoman, and more specifically, the Ottoman-Turkish context. It seemed that wherever I looked, there really were just two renditions of that context. Either it was present by being absent. So if I were to kind of give a metaphor or a sense of what that feels like, it's like something at the tip of your tongue, but that you can't really spit it out. Or that context was overly present, something like a fixation that you can't kind of let go of. That's the sense you get from the literature you read. So almost like the Ottoman Imperial context was there like a clear glass container, transparent, impenetrable, but as a backdrop to the text, or it was really horribly omnipresent. It's like a cataract that blots out everything else. And so I had my work cut out for me to be able to kind of break out of these two restrictions or impediments. It didn't seem right. It didn't seem right that these were my two options. And it naturally led me to wonder, could it really be that either Ottoman Armenian writers had nothing to say about being Ottoman subjects, or that all they had to relate about that experience was the representation of Turks as bloodthirsty killers? I mean, it seemed pretty odd and very difficult to believe that these really were my two options. So I started searching for Ottoman Turks in Armenian literature that were neither invisible nor wholly inimical, neither suppressed nor maligned. And I really hoped that I'd encounter one, at least one, that might even be neighborly or friendly or even beloved. Surely there had to be a character, an experience, an incident that indicated some kind of rapport or affinity. I mean, there couldn't just be hate. That was not humanly possible. And my discovery of Oshagan's work, as I noted earlier, was precisely a vindication of those suspicions. And you can feel free to ask me more about that in the Q&A if you like. I wasn't the only one turning to Armenian literature at the time for precisely a literary way out of entrenched hostilities. The internationally renowned Turkish author Elif Shafak seemed to be on a similar search, and she had discovered Zabel Yessayan in the process. So in 2005, she related her discovery and her own reading of Yessayan's life and work at a now famous or infamous milestone conference that took place at Bilgi University in Istanbul. And that conference, maybe many of you know, its theme was Ottoman Armenians in the Era of the Empire's Collapse, Scholarly Responsibility and Questions of Democracy. So that was the title of the conference. And the event was much mediatized because it was initially blocked twice by the government, even though the event didn't directly address the genocide. It focused more on the role and history of Armenians in the late Ottoman Empire and early Republican Turkey. But regardless, the speakers delivered a significant blow to the Turkish nationalist taboo by openly referring to these events as genocide and by publicly rewriting silenced Armenian voices and figures into Ottoman and Turkish history. Shafak, one of the speakers, played a decisive role here in that she presented Yessayan to a non-Armenian and specifically Turkish audience in Istanbul proper, something that had not occurred with such visibility and scope before. And this gesture arguably ignited today's enthusiasm for Yessayan in Turkey. And it's not a negligible enthusiasm. I say a bit about that in my introduction to Captive Nights if you're interested in further details. So Yessayan has really become an icon in progressive Turkish literary and cultural circles. There have been public events about her, academic courses, published papers, online commentaries. There's been even a play fictionalizing her life. So that's in addition to several translations of her works published by Aras Publishing House, which I mentioned earlier. And she's even listed in the online Istanbul Women's Museum. It's not an exaggeration to say this is all kind of a posthumous dream come true for her. So I'm sure she's elated wherever she is in the afterlife, if there is an afterlife. In life, Yessayan was actually very keen to be translated into Turkish. And that's actually a shared sentiment. I've come across it in Oshagan's work as well. She would have done the translations herself if her knowledge of Ottoman Turkish had been good enough. These details that I'm about to kind of provide are actually available in an exceptional study, really, of Yessayan's life by the scholar Léon Kecheyan, based in France. He wrote an unpublished French language doctoral dissertation in 2002 that's unfortunately often unacknowledged, and it's relatively unknown because it's actually quite difficult to obtain, but extraordinarily significant for an understanding of Yessayan, especially Yessayan's relationship to Turkish contexts and figures. So Kecheyan based his biography on a meticulous reading of Yessayan's correspondences, which he also translated into French as part of his dissertation. And it's there that we find some of the most interesting details regarding Yessayan's associations with the Ottoman Turkish context, including notably with Ottoman Turkish women. In one of those letters, which she wrote to her husband in 1909 from Istanbul. So her husband was Dikran Yessayan, a well-known painter. based in Paris. And she, writing from Istanbul to her husband in Paris, she announced that one of her essays was translated into Turkish and published in the main periodical run by the Committee of Union and Progress. This was the political party that was ultimately responsible for perpetrating the genocide. And she says that the piece was apparently so well received that she'd become something of a local celebrity overnight. She was being recognized and congratulated by members of the public and even Ottoman Turkish notables while she was just out on excursions. And she confessed with pride to her husband, understandably, that she was quite pleased at finally being recognized by a great or big nation. Now, Turkish translations of Yessayan's writings were actually very much in demand in Istanbul at the time, but it seems from her letter that she needed her husband to translate her works for her. Dikran Yessayan was a highly educated man, a published author. He was versed in Arabic, French, and Ottoman Turkish, among other languages, whereas Zabel Yessayan only had a basic knowledge of Turkish, at least according to Leon Keçeyan's findings. So she relied on her husband, based in Paris, for translations into Turkish. And unfortunately, the ones that were in demand never got translated into Turkish because they couldn't collaborate between Istanbul and Paris by letter. Now, as for who was requesting these translations from Yessayan, these were Turkish acquaintances of hers and her husband from Paris. We often forget that Yessayan, who hailed from Istanbul, spent actually a significant portion of her life in Paris, where she had a very large Parisian intellectual milieu, where she collaborated with French writers, wrote in French, translated French writers' works into Armenian, and vice versa. So the city really was her second home. And it certainly was the preferred home of her husband, Dikran Yessayan, who really didn't feel very comfortable in Istanbul. So as to how Yessayan had gone to Paris, she'd been actually sent there in 1895 when she was 17 years old. She'd been sent there by her father, and there were a couple of reasons for this. First, he was very open-minded, extraordinarily so for his generation, and he wanted his daughter, precociously intelligent and writerly, to receive a proper education, and he encouraged her to follow her literary interests and pursuits. The second reason was a more pragmatic one. He wanted to protect his daughter from what was becoming an increasingly stifling and downright dangerous political situation for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at the time. As many of you probably know, between 1894 and 1896, massacres, mass incarceration, and other forms of political repression against Armenians were overwhelming realities under the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdulhamid II. And Europe offered many Armenians who had the financial means or other opportunities a way to escape those circumstances. And Yessayan was lucky that her father presented those means to her. Of course, Armenians weren't the only ones seeking refuge abroad. There were liberal-minded Turks also, and others from the Ottoman Empire who had fled or been forced to flee. And many of them resided in Paris. It was Dikran Yessayan, Zabel's husband, who knew several such individuals whom he either met or became close to when he too moved to Paris to pursue his painting career. He was also the nephew of a high-level Ottoman Armenian official, Mikhail Pasha Portukalyan. And so he had unusually good connections to Ottoman Turkish elite circles. In Paris, he congregated with many of them who shared his hopes for a constitutionally governed Ottoman state that would provide equal citizenship for all, regardless of religion or ethnicity. And that's how Zabel Yessayan, as his wife, also established connections with several well-known Turkish figures. Notably, these figures included Selma Reza, the sister of Ahmet Reza, who was a key member of the Committee for Union and Progress, also a Turkish nationalist, the journalist Hasan Fehmi and his wife, and the anti-unionist journalist Ali Kemal. Yessayan's relationship with Selma Reza cooled, however, after she returned to Istanbul in 1908, after the constitutional revolution. This revolution wrested power away from Sultan Abdülhamid II and reinstated the Ottoman constitution and the parliament. And in her letters, Yessayan expressed distrust of Selma, who she claimed had become worryingly and increasingly nationalist after her own return to Istanbul. On the other hand, she developed her existing relationship with the wife of Hasan Fehmi. She was actually a French woman who'd married an Ottoman Turkish journalist. They too had returned to Istanbul. And in 1908, Zabel Yessayan, again, I'm drawing on Keçeyan here and his impeccable work, Zabel Yessayan and Hasan Fehmi's wife met to discuss a plan to set up a League of Ottoman Women's Solidarity. And this was meant to be a non-political organization established for the express aim of building solidarity among all Ottoman women, regardless of religion or creed. As Keçeyan summarizes, one of its projects was to advance girls' and women's education toward that aim. It was supposed to consist of 9 women, both Muslim and Christian, and they intended to organize meetings, conferences, translations, all kinds of educational projects towards knowledge exchange between communities. And that included also language instruction of Turkish and other European languages to facilitate closer ties amongst themselves. But the project sadly fell through in April 1909 when Hasan Fehmi was assassinated for his critical writings against the CUP leadership. And in addition, that month, as again many of you may know, a bloody counter-revolution ignited that led to what's known as the Adana Massacres, in which tens of thousands of Armenians were killed by Muslim mobs in Cilicia. Some of the instigators and supporters were members of the governing party, and the events provoked tremendous shock, uproar, and terror among Armenians who had hoped that the revolution marked an end to these kinds of state crimes. What followed was an environment of distrust and trepidation that left very little room at this point for building bridges of solidarity, women's or otherwise. And Zabel Yessayan is probably best known for her confrontation with this particular event, both as a humanitarian delegate dealing with its aftermath and as a writer chronicling the devastation as she saw it firsthand. She chronicled that devastation in her very famous book, Pavagane in the Ruins, which was published in 1911. A lot has been said about the silences and the aporias that the book tries to convey, and I'm not really at all convinced that it is actually a book of silence, despite some of the psychoanalytic interpretations that have been advanced by some literary scholars. I think there's a disproportionate reliance on trauma studies there to try to make sense of the book. And I think actually a closer reading shows some very radical, even militant aspects that have been domesticated through such interpretations. To really glean what those aspects are, you need to be aware that she was also writing other things at the same time as she was already composing Pavagane in the Ruins and publishing them, that directly responded to her experiences as a humanitarian and a writer in Cilicia. So several fictional stories appeared around this time in the Armenian press, and they dramatized the events in Cilicia through the perspective of Turkish women. And they were presented as wives, mothers, and daughters who were implicated and involved in the crimes against Armenians in Cilicia. They're extremely unflattering and very provocative stories, replete with revenge fantasies, if you like, very strong antagonistic language, and they convey quite clearly and understandably Yessayan's outrage at what she was witnessing in Cilicia. But I don't want to stop there. I don't want to suggest that these stories were just exposés of Turkish women's wrongdoings or revenge fantasies. They really do reflect Yessayan's very genuine conviction that women have a role to play in enacting social change and preventing violence. Her plans for a League of Ottoman Women's Solidarity may have fallen through, but these narratives that I'm talking about that were published at the same time as In the Ruins, and their echoes within the ruins suggests that Yessayan was calling on Turkish women to rally support for Armenians in the hopes of preventing further instances of such violence. So she actually has several commentaries that she had already published, really discussing Armenian women's role in society, in which she makes these sort of positions very clear, and sometimes in sort of incomprehensibly, seemingly retrograde, antiquated ways. I know Yessayan is thought of as a feminist, but her expectations of how women could contribute to society sometimes sound extremely patriarchal. She really believed that women had a role to play in the family as mothers and educators to raise enlightened men, as opposed to men who under their circumstances really had a role to play as public figures and protectors. So there are certain binaries that are a bit, perhaps for us, uncomfortable in Yessayan's writing, but they do nonetheless express this position of hers that women are social actors even in and through their domestic contexts. So what's odd is that just a few years later, after writing these what come across as extremely antagonistic works, Yessayan took sort of a dramatic turn, at least judging by the tone that followed. So it seems that Yessayan suddenly developed a concern for Turkish and more generally Muslim women, at least in the public discourse. So suddenly she starts writing on Muslim women's liberation, making some extremely critical comments about their sequestration, the fact that their lives aren't just structured by custom, but that they're literally directly being policed. So that when you speak of Muslim women, she says, you have to confront Islamic government policies, not just social mores. So she seems to be particularly, maybe even disproportionately bothered by the practice of veiling. Or so it seems. That's the impression one gets from her writing, since she even publishes a story entitled The Veil, Kor, which I've included in Captive Nights. Now, it's very easy in this context in which there seems to be this disproportionate concern with veiling in Yessayan's writing to read her preoccupation as exclusively a comment on Muslim women's situation. But I would argue that it serves a much more symbolic, a subversive, even a polysemic role. It has multiple meanings, the veil, I mean, and operates on several registers. Now, the symbolism of the veil in Yessayan's work has been noted. It's been noted by Krikor Beledian, writing on Yessayan's story, My Soul in Exile, Hoki Saksorial. And that seems to be a seemingly unrelated work to what we're discussing here. And Beledian points out that there's a mention of veiling in that work, a veil of mist that clouds the Armenian protagonist, Emma's consciousness, but he interprets that veiling as a metaphor for sexuality. My Soul in Exile, or Hoki Saksorial, was written sometime between 1917 and 1922. In any case, it was a post-war work, but we're not exactly sure when. It's certainly true that there is a question of sexuality here with respect to the veil, but that could perhaps point to or be better understood in terms of sexual differentiation rather than sexual desire. As the story The Veil suggests, veiling for Yessayan is actually a marker of differentiation. It's the symbol of an imposed identity that expresses the collective marginalization or subjugation of a hierarchically defined group of people. In that respect, it expresses not just the situation of Turkish women per se, but all marginalized groups that have been hierarchically defined. In the Islamic Ottoman context, that predominantly means also non-Muslims, and for Yessayan, especially also Armenians. This seems to be kind of a motif that's floating around at the time. And that may begin as early as Bedros Tuyan and his famous poem, Turkuhin, the Turkish Women. There are several writers who have such poems representing Turkish women, and they're not just sort of exotic Orientalist depictions. They're not mimetic in that respect. They're not just following sort of a European aesthetic. There's a genuine connection here with the figure of the Turkish woman, genuine sympathy that comes through, but also a way of symbolically representing, it seems, another experience, the Armenian experience. And so it's not terribly surprising or unprecedented that Yessayan is doing a similar thing here with this story, The Veil. And what Yessayan's readers perhaps don't realize is that she was really far more political, and I would say even militant, than anyone gives her credit for. And that's long before her communist leanings. Connected with that, she was extremely elusive and shrewd in her writings. And there were reasons for that. She needed to circumvent literary restrictions, right? Censorship. Let's not forget that she had grown up under censorship. And she speaks about that in one of her early commentaries, where she also states how she and her peers needed to use all kinds of subtilité. She uses the French word subtleties to get around that censorship. So the theme or metaphor of the veil, I would argue, is one of those subtilités, one of those subtle techniques. And she'd already devised that long before she wrote The Veil, I also would argue, while writing in Paris. So she has a story from 1899 that is highly symbolic. It at first glance looks just like some kind of a cheesy love story. The premise is that we're in a wealthy pasha's harem. There's a reclining Muslim woman, by the sounds of it, who seems sort of wistfully to be reminiscing about her homeland, and her Muslim, presumably Turkish husband says, "Hey, where's your veil? You look beautiful with that veil on. Why don't you put the veil on?" And she keeps looking around and she can't find the veil. It turns out that their servant has actually stolen the veil. He seems to be not just infatuated with this woman, but seems to also be identifying with her. He is then discovered with the veil and hanged for his crime. So when you first read the story, it seems like a fairly kind of uninteresting work of romantic melodrama, but you need to understand that it was published in 1899, when there were very severe restrictions on what could or could not be written. You certainly could not write about national issues or political issues or the plight of non-Muslim subjects. So you needed to devise certain kinds of symbolic alternatives. And this, I think, is where the veil becomes precisely a symbol of differentiation that is shared between the Muslim wife and the unspecified, religiously unspecified non-Muslim servant. So I think when Yessayan comes back to the veil in 1914, she very much has the same symbol, this metaphor in mind. Let's not also forget that censorship was back in 1912. So it was lifted for a couple of years after the constitutional revolution in 1908, but censorship was then reinstated. We have the instance of Hagop Siruni, who was the editor of Azadamard in Istanbul, for example, who was imprisoned for several months in Istanbul for having published a translated commentary written by the English Buxton brothers. So you could still end up in jail, like you did in the era of Sultan Abdulhamid II, for writing things that you shouldn't, that could be considered dissident or subversive. My point here is that when we encounter Turkish women in Yessayan's writing, we need to be aware that there's a parallel discourse about Armenian subjecthood. The veil is indeed polysemic. even though it doesn't actually characterize or dramatize Armeno-Turkish relations or solidarity. The symbolism of the veil implicitly establishes that relationship or solidarity between non-Muslim subjects and Turkish women. So in one of her writings, which I've uncovered on Muslim Turkish liberation, she uses words like ıstırgıtun and references to Turkish women living behind cages like prisons. These are motifs and words that at this time are indicative of the Armenian discourse of subjecthood. So ıstırgıtun, kerutun were terms that were regularly used by Armenians to describe their status as non-Muslim subjects. And as I've written elsewhere, the trope of the prison or prison discourses and narratives in literature were very widely disseminated and read as representations of the Armenian and non-Muslim experience in the Ottoman Empire. I've uncovered another sort of social history of political imprisonment in the late Ottoman Empire, in which the empire is described as a prison country by an Armenian scholar of the time. So while it seems that she's writing on Turkish women's liberation in this article, there's definitely a very strong subtext that is also reflecting back on the Armenian and the non-Muslim experience. In other words, Yessayan's bigger concern here is the situation of the empire as a form of hierarchical categorization that privileges some and disadvantages others. Now, the story Pavagane Enough is sort of the clearest illustration, I think, of that position in probably all of her writing. And it's, as I said, one of the stories in Captive Nights. In many ways, it's quite straightforward, so I don't feel all that compelled to discuss it in great depth. And it very explicitly espouses pacifism. Now, Yessayan had kind of become involved in pacifism. I think it was kind of inevitable as a progressive intellectual at the time. And she had French literary contemporaries that were writing about pacifism. And so she was also deeply influenced by, I think, what they had to say and the kind of the spirit of the time during the First World War. But I think what's important also to note that Yessayan's pacifism isn't passive, and it never was passive. She believed in peace, but even in the ruins, which a lot of scholars have described as like a book of silences, which I really cannot get my head around. Even in the ruins, that pacifism is accompanied by a right to struggle for one's life, really, sort of a defensive struggle for one's life, not for self-determination in a kind of political sense, but simply the right to exist as a cultural national entity. So Pavagane is probably the clearest indication of Yessayan's Armeno-Turkish sentiments of solidarity. There are discussions of Turkish or Muslim suffering there, the emphasis on the state of the empire as a kind of theater of perpetual war. There's a longing and a hope explicitly stated that involves moving out of discourses of difference and enmity. And maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise entirely. Enough was published in 1922. Yessayan had already been under the influence of socialist ideas at this point. She had spent time among pro-Bolshevik friends in Tiflis and Baku, where she had ultimately escaped during the genocide. And so it's not entirely surprising then that she is now writing a story that's trying to transcend national barriers and categories towards some other kind of utopia, which socialism perhaps psychologically offered her at the time. Moving on to perhaps the most mysterious of her works, Melihal Nurihanu, which is the first story in the collection. This was published in 1928. And Yessayan had reestablished herself in Paris at the time. And it was a time that she was seriously exploring the possibility of moving to Soviet Armenia. It was also a time when it was amply clear to Armenian refugees that they really would never be able to return to Turkey. So in 1927, the relatively newly founded Republic of Turkey passed a nationality law that that basically denationalized anyone who hadn't been in the country or taken part in the Turkish national movement of the previous years, which basically meant that Armenians couldn't go back and were stripped of their nationality if they weren't there during the national movement. And of course, that also included Yessayan, who was in Paris. So when we read Meliha Nurihanu, I've sort of given this background, I think this is a context in which we can start seeing a certain level identification here between the figure of Yessayan and the figure of Meliha Nurihanu. So sort of the premise of Meliha Nurihanu is that she's a volunteer nurse in Gallipoli, and she's tormented by her unrequited love for Jalaluddin Bey, who's a leader. She's also a nationalist, presumably CUP member. And in the hospital, she encounters a childhood friend who is now a doctor, in fact, her boss. And this childhood friend is also a close friend of an Armenian doctor who's there, whose family has been deported, and he has no news of them. So there's this tension within the hospital among these various characters, and really an internal tension within Meliha herself between what she seems to be, sort of in spite of herself, spouting as nationalist racist ideology and what she herself is actually feeling at the time. She is also torn between this sort of domineering patriarchal figure of Jalaluddin and the childhood potential love, who is now her boss. And this too is a repeated motif in Zabel Yessayan, and it gives us an insight into where Zabel Yessayan is going with Meliha Nurihanu. Over and over again, Yessayan presents us with women, especially Armenian women, who are stuck between two men. There's the man that's good for her, who loves her, but whose love she cannot reciprocate, and the man who's really bad for her, who is using her. And she seems to be stuck between these two, and it's always a cause of conflict. And more often than not, she ends up with the one who is good for her. And so we have a similar situation with this Turkish figure of Meliha. She seems to be an exact mirror of the Armenian women that she has presented in similar contexts elsewhere. Meliha is also a nurse. Yessayan worked in a hospital as well for several months to support herself in Paris when she was a student there. Yessayan had to dress as a Turkish woman to hide in Istanbul in 1915 when the police were looking for her before she fled to Bulgaria. So there are these overlaps between the identities of Meliha and Yessayan. And there's an overlap in the sort of ideological crisis that's happening here. I've read in a couple of readings of this work that this is an entirely non-ideological novel or story. And there too, I'm not entirely convinced. I think this story may in fact be Yessayan's own expression of an inner struggle at the time, when she is poised between sort of the national cause, the Armenian national cause, and the Soviet cause. It's exactly at that time that she is writing this story. So I think there's a sense of an inner struggle with what was best as or for Armenians moving forward politically. This struggle manifested very sort of problematically in her life, actually. There was a point at which Yessayan was defamed and denounced by the Armenian national cause, the national delegation, specifically by, according to Kecheyan, Boros Nubar Pasha, because she had developed such strong political ties with Soviet Armenian representatives, with sort of the Soviet Armenian delegation. And so she, in one letter, actually expresses this sort of torn situation between these two spheres, in the same way as we see Melihal Nurihanu torn between her nationalist ideology and something that transcends that's not articulated yet or imagined yet as a possibility for her. I guess I should probably stop there, Barlow. I think I may have run out of time, but all that to say, I want to point out again that here too, the Turkish woman in Meliha Nurihanu isn't just a Turkish woman. There is a very legible, easily legible correspondence here between the figure of Zabel and the figure of Meliha, and then also sort of an implicit level of solidarity or understanding here. And we can probably read Meliha Nurihanu then as kind of precisely a gesture of post-national solidarity, probably highly informed with certain Soviet leanings for Yessayan at this time. And I'm happy to sort of tease that out a bit more in the Q&A, but I think maybe I should stop at this point. I think you're muted, Barlow. I can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
Yeah, I muted myself.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that background on Yessayan. I think very interesting analysis, and then the discussion of the three short stories. And I did put in the chat the places where you can go ahead and get those books and read it yourself, and then maybe it'll make sense even more for you what's happening. So if you'd like to ask questions, please go ahead and write the questions in the chat. There already are a couple of questions, but I just wanted to ask you a question because you touched on it right at the end, I think, about the reception of Yessayan by Armenians. In other words, so in this period, especially, let's say, of 1908 to 1915, this period when there was a rebirth, let's say, or a renaissance of Armenian literature, how did the patriarchal society or the literary Armenian society receive Yessayan? Was she criticized?
No, not at all. She was very well received. She was actually goaded to return to Istanbul by Ardaşes Harutyunyan. So she and the writer Ardaşes Harutyunyan had a very close relationship and corresponded regularly between Paris and Istanbul. And when the Constitutional Revolution happened, I think there was maybe a certain semblance of misgiving or trepidation on the part of Yessayan, and basically on the basis of Ardaşes Harutyunyan's exhortations, she returned to Istanbul. He had already put her, I mean, she was constantly in touch, right, with the Istanbul Armenians between Paris and Istanbul, and would go back and forth, and she was always well received. They were always asking her for things to publish, and I think she was even overly busy, overworked, really, in the first few years that she'd been back. So she herself never speaks of any kind of impediments or obstacles, any kind of sexual discrimination that she felt subjected to. And in fact, I think maybe her view was skewed in that respect, so that in her more sort of women's writings or commentaries on the status of women, she kind of dismisses feminists who keep fighting for sort of equal employment opportunities, etc., saying, well, that's not really the real issue here. As you can see, women have been able to penetrate into every sphere of labor and social and political life in other countries. It just comes down to the individual. So she didn't want to sort of accept the systemic issues of sexual discrimination, I think because she herself was so privileged, one through her father and then through her husband. And so her networks, I think, maybe gave her, let's say, a skewed perception of what it was to be a woman. So there's no indication in Yessayan's work and writings that she felt discriminated against.
Great. There are a couple of questions here, and there's one that's actually about your sort of in the biography when I mentioned about your work in the intersection of literature, history, and law. The question is, could you please describe or address the contribution of law in this project, or maybe if it's not in this project, in general in your work? And then there's a specific question about the book. So I'll let you answer that one first.
Sure. In this project, of course, there is. So as I say in my introduction, and I think it might be worth exploring that if you do have the book to hand, my argument is that Yessayan, and not just Yessayan, other writers were directly responding to the legal structures of the Ottoman Empire. So the primary legal structure being the division between Muslims and non-Muslims, with Muslims as kind of the hegemonic population and the non-Muslims enjoying certain privileges, but never as equals to Muslims. So that's the context, which means that when Ottoman Armenian writers at this time are writing, they're cognizant of that legal arrangement, and they're engaging with that legal arrangement. The other is the issue of censorship and how censorship had affected or did affect the history of Armenian literature and the content of Armenian literature between 1876 and 1908. I've unearthed quite a bit of material on that. Hagop Pavagane also speaks extensively on that, the fact that there were certain topics that they couldn't articulate, and that silencing had a profound social, cultural, and psychological effect on Armenians, and literary effect on Armenians. And so I think those are probably the most direct instances of engaging with law in my work.
And then there's a specific question regarding the three works in the volume. The question is, could you please address the vignette structure of the three works in the volume?
Well, I went by the motif of, it says in the introduction, I went by the motif of sleeplessness, which connects the three stories. As I said in the introductory part of my talk, and I don't know whether the individual who asked the question was there, the whole project was thematically conceived. And this was kind of, in my opinion, something of an innovation in a project of Armenian translations. So as I said in the introduction, it'll be a repetition to some of you. Most of the translations that we get from Armenian tend to be sort of haphazard or organized by genre, or excerpts in anthologies or sort of representative works. And the idea behind this collection was precisely not to do that, but rather to speak to a particular social cultural experience that I had been confronting in the material that I had discovered, and that had remained precisely unknown because these works have not been presented within those thematic or theoretical frames. So that explains the vignette structure of the volume.
Okay, and while people again are writing questions, I had another question because you mentioned Elif Shafak and her role in sort of igniting interest in Yessayan at the conference. I'm wondering, in that period since, lots of things have happened in Turkey, of course. Could you comment briefly on how has that continued, in the sense of Yessayan as being sort of a model or someone that's still talked about for women's rights and activism?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are regular conversations, public and academic, and publications referring to her work. I gave a few examples of those in my earlier comments, but nothing comes to mind that I feel is so sort of groundbreaking that I need to mention.
Right, good. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions in the chat. Go ahead and put them in the chat if you would. Again, the book is called Captive Nights, from the Bosporus to Gallipoli, with Zabel Yessayan. It was translated by GM Goshgarian, and Dr. Kebranian was the chief person sort of pushing the project forward. And it was published as volume number 14 in the Armenian series here at Fresno State, and we're very happy to have that as part of the series. I don't see any other questions, but if people want to ask, get in touch with you or anything, I'm sure that you would have no problems. If
Not at all. No, feel free to get in touch.
yeah, and once they go ahead and read the book, and then they'll be able to really come back and see if they have other questions. So we really appreciate your presentation this evening, and we
My
ask
pleasure.
everyone to join us next week for our concert on Friday night here at Fresno State when the Comidas Trio will be here. So on behalf of the Armenian Studies program, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Thanks.
you.